Book nibbles. Big ideas, small bites. When Robert Wright sets out to explain why Buddhism is true, he does not mean true in the sense that every ancient teaching maps perfectly onto the modern world. He means that core aspects of Buddhist thought, especially as they relate to the mind, suffering, and liberation, are validated by modern evolutionary psychology and cognitive science. The book isn't written to convince readers to convert to Buddhism, nor to accept dogma about reincarnation, karma across lifetimes, or supernatural beings. Instead, Wright homes in on the philosophical and psychological dimensions of Buddhism that resonate with contemporary science, showing how meditation reveals truths about our minds that match what evolutionary theory would predict. The argument is that the Buddha understood long before Darwin that much of our suffering stems from the way the human brain was designed by natural selection, and that by practicing mindfulness and insight meditation, we can see through some of those illusions and suffer less. The story begins with a simple but profound question. Why are humans so often unhappy? Why do pleasures fade quickly? Why do we find ourselves restlessly chasing new desires? And why do we become enslaved to anger, anxiety, and craving even when they harm us? The Buddhist diagnosis, which Wright finds compelling, is that suffering arises because we fail to see the world and ourselves clearly. Craving, aversion, and delusion distort our perception, driving us to pursue fleeting pleasures and resist inevitable discomforts. This aligns strikingly with evolutionary psychology's story of the human brain. Natural selection didn't design us to be happy, but to maximize genetic survival. Emotions like desire, fear, jealousy, and dissatisfaction were sculpted to keep our ancestors striving and reproducing, not to give them lasting contentment. From this perspective, suffering is not a cosmic accident, but the predictable side effect of a mind built by evolution. Wright uses vivid examples to bring this point home. Think of how a sweet dessert lights up your taste buds, giving you a brief rush of pleasure. But that pleasure doesn't last long. Soon you crave another bite, then a different flavor, and eventually you tire of the food altogether. This is known as the principle of hedonic adaptation. Natural selection ensured that once we consumed calories, the satisfaction quickly wore off, so we would keep seeking more. Similarly, sexual desire is designed to be intense until consummation, then to fade, pushing us toward new mates. Evolution is brilliant at keeping us on the treadmill of striving, but it is not concerned with whether the treadmill makes us miserable. This endless cycle mirrors the Buddha's teaching of dukkha, the unsatisfactoriness of life lived under craving and ignorance. From this foundation, Wright explores the Buddhist practice of meditation as a tool for confronting the illusions evolution has saddled us with. In mindfulness meditation, you sit quietly, paying attention to your breath, bodily sensations, or thoughts as they arise. At first, it seems simple, even boring, but quickly you realize how unruly the mind is. Thoughts, feelings, and impulses appear unbidden, tugging your attention this way and that. Wright notes how meditation reveals the lack of control we truly have over our own minds, a realization that Buddhist philosophy anticipated centuries ago. Thoughts are not ours in the way we imagine. They arise from causes and conditions, often unconsciously. When you sit and observe without judgment, you see thoughts come and go like clouds, losing some of their grip. One of Wright's striking insights is how meditation exposes the constructed nature of the self. In daily life, we move through the world with the sense that there is a solid, enduring I who is perceiving, choosing, and controlling. But when you pay close attention in meditation, this sense of self begins to fragment. A pain in the knee arises. Where exactly is the I in relation to the pain? A memory floats up. Who authored it? A craving passes through. Does it belong to you, or is it just another event? Neuroscience supports this dissolution of the self. There is no single self-center in the brain, but a coalition of modules that generate perceptions and decisions. The self is more like a story we tell ourselves, useful for navigation but not ultimately real. This dovetails with the Buddhist doctrine of anatta, or non-self. Recognizing that the self is a convenient illusion doesn't mean you vanish into nothingness. It means you stop taking every impulse, judgment, and desire so personally. Wright shares his own experiences on meditation retreats, where hours of sitting sharpened his perception of how feelings drive thoughts. At one point, he describes noticing how anger toward someone was not just a thought, but a bodily sensation. Heat in the chest, tightening in the face. Observing it non-reactively allowed it to pass more quickly, without spiraling into resentment. This matches research in psychology showing that emotions have a half-life. They rise and fall if we don't feed them with ruminative thinking. Meditation trains us to ride the wave rather than drown in it. The book often circles back to the evolutionary angle, grounding Buddhist insights in modern science. For example, our biases toward tribalism, suspicion of outsiders, and constant vigilance for threats were adaptive in ancestral environments. But in modern society, these tendencies fuel prejudice, political polarization, and anxiety. Buddhism's emphasis on compassion and loving kindness counteracts this evolutionary baggage by expanding our circle of concern beyond the narrow boundaries set by natural selection. In fact, studies show that practices like loving-kindness meditation can increase empathy and reduce implicit bias, suggesting that ancient techniques can literally rewire the brain in pro-social ways. Another central theme Wright emphasizes is the illusory nature of perception itself. The Buddha taught that we don't see the world as it is, but through layers of interpretation shaped by craving and aversion. Modern neuroscience agrees. Perception is not a passive recording of reality, but an active construction. The brain takes sensory input and fills in gaps, often distorting the picture. A simple example is the way optical illusions trick us into seeing lines or shapes that aren't there. On a deeper level, emotions color our perception so profoundly that we often mistake subjective feelings for objective truths. When you dislike someone, everything they say seems grating. When you're infatuated, flaws become invisible. Meditation helps by allowing us to step back from these distortions, to see feelings as feelings rather than facts. Wright acknowledges that meditation is not easy and not always blissful. In fact, it often brings us face to face with discomfort we'd rather avoid. Sitting quietly can intensify awareness of pain, restlessness, or sadness. But Buddhism teaches that by accepting these experiences rather than resisting them, we can reduce suffering. Resistance adds a second layer of pain, not just the unpleasant feeling, but the aversion to it. Observing sensations without judgment strips away this second arrow. Wright recalls struggling with restlessness during long sits, only to realize that labeling the restlessness and letting it be was more effective than trying to suppress it. Over time, this practice builds equanimity, a calmness in the face of life's ups and downs. The book doesn't shy away from addressing skepticism. Many people think of meditation as self-indulgent or pseudoscientific. Wright counters with evidence. Clinical studies show mindfulness can reduce anxiety, depression, and chronic pain, while also improving focus and emotional regulation. Brain scans reveal changes in regions linked to self-awareness and compassion. Wright argues that you don't need to accept supernatural claims to benefit from meditation. It is a pragmatic tool for dealing with the realities of human psychology. Wright also explores the tension between the Buddhist aim of enlightenment and our everyday goals shaped by evolution. Evolutionary success often depends on ambition, competition, and desire, while Buddhism urges us to loosen attachment to outcomes. Is it possible to reconcile these? Wright suggests that by reducing the grip of craving, we can pursue goals more wisely. Instead of being enslaved by every desire, we can choose values consciously and act with clarity. He describes how some meditators find they can still strive for success, but without the same anxiety, because they are less identified with the outcome. In a paradoxical way, loosening attachment can actually make us more effective, since we are less clouded by fear and desperation. One of the most compelling chapters deals with the idea of enlightenment, not as a mystical end state, but as a continuum of insight. Full enlightenment may be rare, but even small glimpses, moments of seeing through the self, of experiencing compassion, of being free from craving, are valuable. Wright likens it to upgrading the operating system of the mind, smoothing out bugs installed by evolution. He stresses that enlightenment is not about transcending humanity, but about living more wisely within it. Throughout the book, Wright peppers his analysis with humor and humility. He admits to being a flawed meditator, often distracted or lazy. He shares stories of doubting whether meditation was working, only to notice subtle changes in daily life, like being less reactive in traffic or more patient with family. These anecdotes make the philosophy feel accessible and grounded, showing that Buddhist practice is not about retreating to a monastery, but about engaging with life more skillfully. He also tackles potential misunderstandings. For instance, the doctrine of non-self can sound nihilistic. If there is no self, why care about anything? But Wright explains that recognizing non-self doesn't erase meaning. It reshapes it. When you see yourself as a process rather than an entity, you become less defensive, less entangled in ego. You can care about others more freely, since the boundaries between self and other feel less rigid. This echoes neuroscience findings that meditation reduces activity in the brain's default mode network, associated with self-referential thinking. The less we obsess about me, the more space we have for connection and presence. As the narrative builds, Wright weaves together evolutionary theory, cognitive science, and Buddhist philosophy into a coherent vision. The human brain is a kludge cobbled together by evolution for survival, not happiness. It is riddled with biases, cravings, and distortions. Buddhism offers a toolkit for working with this flawed machinery, helping us see clearly and suffer less. Meditation is the laboratory where these insights become experiential, not just theoretical. And modern science increasingly confirms that these practices have real effects on the mind and body. By the end of the book, the case for Buddhism's truth is not about metaphysical claims, but about practical wisdom. The Buddha diagnosed the human predicament with uncanny accuracy. Life is unsatisfactory because our minds are enslaved to craving and delusion. He prescribed a method, mindfulness, compassion, insight, that modern research supports as effective. We may never be free of suffering entirely, but we can reduce it significantly. And in doing so, live more awake, compassionate, and meaningful lives. Wright closes with an invitation rather than a command. You don't have to believe in reincarnation or miracles. You don't even have to call yourself Buddhist. But if you are willing to sit, to observe, to question the stories your mind tells, you may discover for yourself why Buddhism is true, not in the sense of religious dogma, but in the sense that it works, practically, to help us navigate the strange and often painful reality of being human. And perhaps that is the deepest message of all. The truths of Buddhism are not foreign prescriptions imposed on life, but discoveries waiting in our own minds. They are truths we can see directly, if we have the courage to look. And that's it. Why Buddhism is True. The Science and Philosophy of Meditation and Enlightenment by Robert Wright. Thanks for listening to Book Nibbles. If you enjoyed this bite-sized book, don't forget to subscribe for more quick, insightful summaries. See you in the next nibble.